What happens when a single moment of arrogance meets centuries of unwavering discipline? When modern entitlement crashes against traditional duty? Sometimes, the most profound lessons come not from books or lectures, but from the quiet dignity of those we choose to underestimate. This is the story of Marcus Wellington, a man who thought he understood power, privilege, and respect, until one extraordinary encounter at the gates of Buckingham Palace changed his perspective forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of the Mall as Marcus Wellington adjusted his Armani tie and checked his Rolex for the third time in 5 minutes. The executive had always prided himself on punctuality, though today his early arrival at Buckingham Palace served a different purpose entirely. He wasn't here for any official business or tourist visit. Instead, Marcus had come to settle what he considered a personal score with the very institution that had, in his mind, slighted him the previous week. Marcus was the type of man who collected grievances like fine wines, storing each perceived insult in the cellar of his memory until the perfect moment for revenge presented itself. At 42, he had built a considerable fortune through a combination of inherited wealth, shrewd business dealings, and an almost supernatural ability to hold grudges. His grandfather had been a minor lord, his father a successful industrialist, and Marcus himself had parlayed the family fortune into a tech empire that spanned 3 continents. The slight that brought him to the palace gates on this particular Tuesday morning had occurred during a charity gala the previous week. Marcus had been expecting recognition for his substantial donation to a veterans organization, perhaps even a brief audience with a minor royal. Instead, he had been relegated to what he considered the commoner's table, while others with lesser contributions received what he deemed preferential treatment. The organizers had explained that seating arrangements were based on various factors beyond monetary contributions, but Marcus heard only excuses. Standing now before the iconic gates of Buckingham Palace, Marcus felt the familiar burn of indignation in his chest. The morning tourists hadn't yet arrived in force, leaving him with a relatively clear view of the palace grounds and, more importantly, the guards who stood at their posts with characteristic stoicism. These men, with their distinctive red tunics and tall bearskin hats, had become symbols of British tradition and unwavering duty. To Marcus, however, they represented something else entirely, an outdated system that valued ceremony over substance, tradition over progress. The plan he had concocted was simple in its cruelty. Marcus intended to provoke one of the guards, to expose what he saw as the absurdity of their rigid protocols. He had researched extensively, learning about the guards' training, their code of conduct, and, most importantly, their inability to respond to provocation while on duty. In Marcus's twisted logic, he would demonstrate the meaninglessness of their position by reducing one of these proud soldiers to a figure of ridicule. As he approached the guard station, Marcus noticed the particular soldier who would become the unwitting target of his scheme. The guard appeared younger than some of his colleagues, perhaps in his mid-20s, with the ramrod-straight posture and distant gaze that characterized his profession. His uniform was immaculate, every brass button polished to a mirror shine, his bearskin hat positioned at the precise regulation angle. To any reasonable observer, he represented the epitome of professional military bearing. Marcus began his assault with subtle provocations, commenting loudly to an imaginary companion about the waste of taxpayer money represented by the ceremonial guards. He made jokes about their inability to move, comparing them to museum pieces or decorative statues. When these initial attempts failed to elicit any response, Marcus escalated his tactics. The executive began to circle the guard like a predator stalking prey, his voice growing louder and his comments more personal. He questioned the guard's intelligence, suggested that only the least capable soldiers were assigned to ceremonial duties, and made disparaging remarks about the guard's family and background. Other early morning visitors began to take notice, some clearly uncomfortable with the one-sided confrontation unfolding before them. Throughout this barrage of insults and provocations, The guard remained absolutely motionless. His eyes stared straight ahead. His breathing remained controlled, and his grip on his rifle never wavered. To Marcus, this stoicism was not admirable discipline, but rather evidence of the guard's inability to think for himself, proof that he was nothing more than a wind-up toy in an elaborate royal pageant. Emboldened by what he interpreted as victory, Marcus decided to push his harassment to the next level. He began to make increasingly personal attacks, inventing stories about the guard's family, suggesting that his parents were ashamed of his career choice, and questioning his masculinity and courage. The small crowd that had gathered watched in horrified fascination as this well-dressed man systematically attempted to humiliate a soldier who was bound by duty and protocol to endure the abuse in silence. Marcus's voice carried across the courtyard as he delivered what he thought would be his final, crushing blow. He suggested that the guard was a coward hiding behind ceremony, that real soldiers were fighting overseas while he played dress-up for tourists. He questioned whether the guard had ever seen real combat, whether he had ever done anything genuinely brave or meaningful in his life. The executive's words dripped with contempt and condescension, each syllable calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage. What Marcus failed to notice, in his self-satisfied cruelty, were the subtle signs that his target was not the empty-headed ceremonial figure he had imagined. The guard's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, and a muscle in his cheek twitched with the effort of maintaining his composure. His breathing, while still controlled, had shifted into the rhythm of someone managing significant stress through trained discipline. As Marcus prepared to deliver another round of insults, something unexpected happened. A small child, no more than 6 years old, broke away from her parents and approached the guard. She looked up at his towering figure with wide, curious eyes and asked in a clear, innocent voice, "Are you a real soldier?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Marcus had been saying. For the first time since his harassment had begun, the guard's eyes moved slightly, looking down at the child with an expression that mixed professional restraint with genuine warmth. In that moment, Marcus saw something he hadn't expected: humanity. "Yes, little one," the guard replied in a voice so quiet that only those nearby could hear. "I am." The child smiled and reached into her pocket, pulling out a small drawing she had made of a soldier. "This is for you," she said, offering the paper to the guard. "My daddy says soldiers are heroes." The guard's composure nearly broke as he looked at the child's offering. His voice, when he spoke again, carried a weight that Marcus was only beginning to understand. "Thank you very much. That's the kindest gift I've received in a very long time." As the child returned to her parents, beaming with pride at the guard's acceptance of her gift, Marcus felt the first stirring of doubt about his assumptions. The brief interaction had revealed layers of character and emotion that didn't fit his simplistic narrative of mindless ceremonial figures. The guard's response to the child had been genuine, warm, and entirely human in a way that contradicted everything Marcus had been telling himself about these men. But Marcus's certainty in his own righteousness was too deeply rooted to be shaken by a single moment of doubt. He convinced himself that the guard's interaction with the child was merely another part of the performance, a calculated move to win sympathy from onlookers. His harassment resumed with renewed vigor, his voice growing louder and his accusations more vicious. Unknown to Marcus, his behavior had not gone unnoticed by palace security. Cameras had recorded every moment of his sustained assault on the guard, and personnel were already beginning to take a keen interest in the well-dressed man who seemed determined to cause a scene at one of London's most iconic locations. Phone calls were being made, background checks were being run, and a very different kind of attention was beginning to focus on Marcus Wellington. The executive continued his verbal assault, unaware that each word was being documented and analyzed. He had become so absorbed in his campaign of humiliation that he failed to notice the changing atmosphere around him. The small crowd that had initially watched in uncomfortable silence was beginning to show signs of active disapproval. Whispered conversations and pointed looks made it clear that public sentiment was not swinging in Marcus's favor. A middle-aged woman in the crowd finally spoke up, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I think you've made your point, sir. Perhaps it's time to move along." Marcus turned to face this new challenger, his eyes blazing with the righteous anger of someone who believed he was fighting injustice. "This is a public space, madam. I have every right to express my opinion about the waste of resources represented by this medieval charade." The woman's response was measured but firm. "You have the right to express your opinion, but not to harass someone who cannot defend himself. That's not courage, sir. That's cowardice." The word cowardice hit Marcus like a physical blow. Throughout his life, he had prided himself on his willingness to confront what he saw as injustice, to speak truth to power regardless of the consequences. The suggestion that his actions represented cowardice rather than courage challenged the very foundation of his self-image. "I'm exposing the absurdity of this system," Marcus replied, his voice rising. "These men are paid to stand here like statues while real problems exist in the world. They're symbols of everything that's wrong with outdated institutions and blind respect for meaningless tradition." The guard, throughout this exchange, remained perfectly still. His eyes continued to stare straight ahead. His breathing remained controlled, and his posture never wavered. To Marcus, this continued silence was proof of his point about the guard's inability to think or act independently. To the growing crowd of observers, however, the guard's discipline in the face of such sustained provocation was becoming increasingly impressive. An elderly gentleman in a worn but well-maintained suit stepped forward from the crowd. His bearing suggested military experience, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. "Young man," he said, addressing Marcus, "I wonder if you understand what you're looking at when you see this soldier." Marcus turned his attention to this new speaker, sensing an opportunity to expand his audience for what he saw as an important lesson about contemporary priorities. "I see someone playing dress-up while real soldiers fight real wars." The elderly man's expression remained calm, but something in his eyes suggested that Marcus had just made a significant miscalculation. "Do you indeed? And what exactly do you imagine qualifies you to make such judgments about military service and sacrifice?" The question caught Marcus off guard. Throughout his campaign of harassment, he had assumed the moral high ground based on his business success and social position. The idea that his qualifications to judge military service might themselves be questioned had not occurred to him. "I'm a successful businessman," Marcus replied, falling back on the credentials that had served him throughout his life. "I understand efficiency and resource allocation. I can see when systems are outdated and personnel are misused." The elderly man smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Business success. Yes, I imagine that does give one perspective on efficiency. Tell me, in your business dealings, do you often find it effective to attack people who cannot defend themselves?" Marcus felt another flicker of doubt, quickly suppressed. "I'm not attacking anyone. I'm making valid points about institutional waste and misplaced priorities. By hurling personal insults at a soldier on duty?" The elderly man's voice remained calm, but his words carried an edge that made several people in the crowd nod in agreement. "By questioning his courage and intelligence? By suggesting his family should be ashamed of him? These strike you as valid points about institutional policy." For the first time since beginning his harassment campaign, Marcus found himself genuinely challenged by someone who seemed immune to his usual tactics of intimidation and social positioning. The elderly man's questions forced him to examine the methods he had chosen to make his point, and under that scrutiny, his actions began to appear less noble than he had convinced himself they were. "The point," Marcus said, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty for the first time, "is that these ceremonial positions are meaningless in the modern world. Resources and human potential are being wasted on pageantry while real problems go unsolved." "And you believe," the elderly man replied, "that the appropriate response to this perceived waste is to publicly humiliate an individual soldier who had no role in creating the policies you oppose? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Marcus found himself struggling to articulate a response that didn't make him sound petty and cruel. Around him, the crowd had grown larger and more attentive, drawn by the increasingly intense confrontation playing out before the palace gates. The guard, meanwhile, continued his silent vigil. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, his breathing stayed controlled, and his posture never wavered despite the emotional and psychological assault he had endured for nearly an hour. To those watching, his discipline was becoming less a symbol of mindless obedience and more a demonstration of remarkable self-control under extreme provocation. Marcus felt the weight of the crowd's attention and realized that the dynamic of the situation was not developing as he had planned. Instead of exposing the absurdity of the ceremonial guards, he was beginning to appear as the unreasonable party in the confrontation. The realization filled him with anger rather than reflection, and he decided to escalate his tactics once more. "Fine," Marcus announced loudly, addressing both the elderly man and the crowd. "If you all want to pretend that this is meaningful work, that standing motionless in a costume represents some kind of valuable service, then let me demonstrate exactly how meaningless it really is." With that declaration, Marcus approached the guard directly, positioning himself mere inches from the soldier's face. The crowd fell silent, sensing that the confrontation was about to reach a critical moment that would define everything that had come before. Standing inches from the guard's face, Marcus could see every detail of the young soldier's features. Up close, he noticed things that his anger had prevented him from observing before. A small scar above the left eyebrow, the kind that comes from shrapnel or combat debris, calluses on the hands that suggested extensive weapon handling, and, most telling of all, eyes that held a depth of experience that seemed incongruous with his apparent youth. "Look at him," Marcus announced to the crowd, his voice dripping with theatrical contempt. "The perfect example of wasted human potential, standing here like a mannequin while the world burns around him. Tell me, soldier," he said, addressing the guard directly despite knowing he wouldn't receive a response. "When was the last time you did anything that actually mattered? When did you last make a real difference in anyone's life?" The guard's breathing remained steady, but Marcus was close enough now to see the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. For someone trained in reading people, as Marcus prided himself on being, these micro-expressions should have served as a warning. Instead, his arrogance blinded him to the signs that he was pushing a highly trained and disciplined individual toward the limits of his restraint. The elderly gentleman who had challenged Marcus earlier stepped closer, his own patience clearly wearing thin. "Sir, you've made your point. Whatever grievance you believe you have with the institution, this young man doesn't deserve to be your target." Marcus whirled around to face his critic, his face flushed with anger and frustration. Deserve? He's being paid to stand here and be looked at like an exhibit in a zoo. If he didn't want to be treated like a tourist attraction, perhaps he should have chosen a career that involves actual work. Actual work? The elderly man's voice carried a dangerous edge that several people in the crowd recognized as the sound of someone who had reached the end of their tolerance for foolishness. "Young man, I think it's time you learned something about the person you've spent the last hour trying to humiliate." Marcus felt a chill of uncertainty, but pushed it aside, his pride refusing to allow him to back down now. "I don't need to learn anything about him. His choice to dress up and play soldier tells me everything I need to know about his character and his priorities." The elderly man reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a smartphone, his fingers moving with surprising agility as he accessed something on the screen. "His name," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent courtyard, "is Lance Corporal James Mitchell, 24 years old. Joined the British Army at 18 against his family's wishes because he believed in service to something greater than himself." Marcus opened his mouth to interrupt, but the elderly man continued, his voice growing stronger and more authoritative with each word. "He served 2 tours in Afghanistan with a parachute regiment. During his first deployment, He was part of a convoy that was ambushed outside Kandahar. When their lead vehicle was hit by an improvised explosive device, Lance Corporal Mitchell left the safety of his armored vehicle to provide medical assistance to wounded Afghan civilians who had been caught in the crossfire. The crowd had grown completely silent, every person straining to hear details that were transforming their understanding of the situation unfolding before them. Marcus felt the first real stirring of unease, but his pride and anger still dominated his reasoning. He was awarded the Military Cross for gallantry. The elderly man continued, after spending 45 minutes in open ground under sporadic sniper fire, treating wounded civilians and coordinating their evacuation. 3 of the people he saved that day were children under the age of 10. The words hit the crowd like physical blows, and Marcus could feel the atmosphere around him shifting dramatically. What had begun as a somewhat uncomfortable scene of public confrontation was transforming into something much more serious, a moment of moral reckoning. The elderly man wasn't finished. During his second deployment, Lance Corporal Mitchell's unit was tasked with training Afghan National Army recruits. He volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, those that required working closely with local forces in areas where insider attacks were a constant threat. His commanding officers noted his exceptional ability to build trust and rapport with Afghan soldiers, many of whom credited him with saving their lives through his training and mentorship. Marcus felt his certainty beginning to crumble, but desperation made him double down on his position. "Anyone can make up stories," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments earlier. "How do we know any of this is true?" The elderly man smiled grimly and turned his phone screen toward the crowd. On it was displayed an official military citation, complete with photographs and official seals. But more than that, the screen showed a newspaper article with a photograph of a young soldier in combat gear, surrounded by smiling Afghan children, the same face that was now hidden beneath the ceremonial bearskin hat. James Mitchell was medically retired from active combat duty after being wounded by a roadside bomb during his second tour. The elderly man continued relentlessly. The explosion left him with hearing damage in his left ear and persistent pain from shrapnel wounds. He was offered a medical discharge and a disability pension. Instead, he requested reassignment to ceremonial duties so he could continue serving his country in the only way his injuries would allow. The revelation hit the crowd like a thunderbolt, and Marcus could feel hostile eyes turning toward him from every direction. The guard he had been tormenting wasn't a symbol of wasted resources or meaningless tradition. He was a wounded warrior who had sacrificed his health and risked his life for others, now serving his country in the only capacity his injuries permitted. The ceremonial guard, the elderly man's voice carried a note of genuine anger now, is not a punishment detail or a repository for the incompetent. It's a position of honor, requiring exceptional discipline, physical fitness within the constraints of medical limitations, and the mental strength to maintain dignity under exactly the kind of provocation you've been providing. Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, his entire narrative about the encounter crumbling in the face of facts he hadn't bothered to consider. Around him, the crowd's disapproval was becoming palpable, with several people making comments that left no doubt about their opinion of his behavior. Furthermore, the elderly man continued, clearly intent on driving home every aspect of Marcus's ignorance. These men undergo extensive background checks, psychological evaluation, and training that would challenge many people who consider themselves physically and mentally tough. They're chosen not just for their military record, but for their character, their stability, and their ability to represent the best of British military tradition. The systematic destruction of his assumptions left Marcus reeling, but pride and desperation drove him to one final, desperate attack. "Even if all that's true," he said, his voice rising to a near shout, "it doesn't change the fact that standing here motionless is a waste of his abilities. He could be doing something more useful with his life." The response came not from the elderly man, but from an unexpected source. A woman in her 30s, wearing a nurse's uniform beneath her coat, stepped forward from the crowd. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady but filled with emotion. "My brother was killed in Afghanistan 3 years ago," she said, her words cutting through Marcus's bluster like a blade. He was 22 years old, a Royal Marine who died trying to save his wounded sergeant. "Do you want to know what his last letter home said?" Marcus found himself unable to respond, trapped between his crumbling position and his inability to gracefully retreat from it. The nurse continued, tears beginning to form in her eyes, but her voice remaining strong. "He wrote that he hoped, if he didn't make it home, people would remember that soldiers like him had tried to make a difference. He said he hoped that those who survived would find ways to continue serving, even if they couldn't fight anymore." She turned to look directly at the guard, who remained motionless but whose jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. "When I see this man standing here, maintaining dignity and discipline despite everything you've thrown at him, I see someone honoring my brother's memory. I see someone who's found a way to keep serving even after being wounded in service to others." The emotional weight of her words settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket, and Marcus found himself facing something he had rarely encountered in his privileged life: genuine moral opposition from people who had suffered real loss and understood real sacrifice. But the revelations weren't over. Another voice spoke up from the crowd, this one belonging to a middle-aged man with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "I'm Colonel Harrison, retired," the man said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a career military officer. "I served with the Parachute Regiment for 30 years, including 2 tours alongside American forces in Iraq and 3 in Afghanistan. I know Lance Corporal Mitchell's record personally, and I can tell you that every word you've heard about his service is accurate." The colonel's intervention carried special weight, and Marcus could feel the last vestiges of support for his position evaporating around him. But the retired officer wasn't finished. "What you may not realize," Colonel Harrison continued, "is that ceremonial duties are considered a privilege within the military community. These positions are highly sought after and awarded only to soldiers with exceptional records. The men you see here have been selected not just for their military service, but for their character, their discipline, and their ability to represent the very best of what military service means." Marcus felt cornered, his carefully constructed justification for his behavior collapsing around him. In desperation, he made one final attempt to salvage his position. "Fine, maybe I was wrong about his background. But that doesn't change the fundamental point about resource allocation and institutional priorities." The response came from yet another unexpected quarter. A young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, stepped forward from the crowd. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the confidence of someone who knew her facts. "I'm a doctoral candidate in economics at the London School of Economics," she said, "and I've actually studied the economic impact of Britain's ceremonial institutions. The ceremonial guard alone generates over £50 million annually in tourism revenue. The broader royal ceremonial system contributes nearly £2 billion to the UK economy each year." Marcus felt another pillar of his argument crumbling, but the young economist wasn't finished. "Beyond the direct economic impact," she continued, "these ceremonies and traditions serve important diplomatic and cultural functions. They're part of Britain's soft power projection, contributing to international relationships and cultural influence that have measurable economic and political benefits." The systematic destruction of every aspect of his argument left Marcus feeling exposed and foolish, but his pride still prevented him from acknowledging his errors. Instead, he fell back on personal attack, the refuge of those who have lost the intellectual battle. "Easy enough to defend tradition when you're not the one being asked to sacrifice your individuality for it," he said, gesturing toward the guard who had remained silent throughout the entire confrontation. This attack proved to be Marcus's fatal mistake. The crowd, which had been growing increasingly hostile toward him, now turned genuinely angry. Several people began speaking at once, their voices overlapping in a chorus of condemnation. "He volunteered for this duty," someone called out. "He's already sacrificed more than you'll ever understand," another voice added. "You've been torturing that man for over an hour," a third person contributed, "and he's shown more dignity and self-control than you've demonstrated in your entire performance." The weight of collective disapproval pressed down on Marcus like a physical force. But what happened next would change everything he thought he understood about power, respect, and human dignity. A new voice cut through the crowd's anger, calm and authoritative in a way that immediately commanded attention. "I think," the voice said, "it's time for some perspective on this situation." Marcus turned to see a distinguished man in his 60s approaching, flanked by two individuals in plain clothes who nevertheless carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of security personnel. The newcomer's bearing and the deference shown to him by the palace guards who had begun to gather suggested someone of considerable authority. "I am General Sir Robert Thornfield," the man announced, director of the Household Division. "I believe you gentlemen are discussing one of my soldiers." The title and introduction sent a chill through Marcus that had nothing to do with the London weather. The general wasn't just any military officer. He was the person responsible for all ceremonial duties at royal residences, a man whose word could influence policy at the highest levels of British society. General Thornfield approached the guard who had been the target of Marcus's harassment, stopping directly in front of him, but addressing the crowd. "Lance Corporal Mitchell has been standing at his post for 2 hours this morning, maintaining perfect discipline and composure despite sustained verbal assault. His conduct has been exemplary and fully in keeping with the highest traditions of his regiment and his service." The general then turned to face Marcus directly, his eyes carrying the kind of authority that comes from decades of command responsibility. "You, sir, have provided an excellent demonstration of why the discipline and character required for ceremonial duty is so highly valued. Not everyone, clearly, possesses the moral strength to maintain dignity under pressure." Marcus felt the full weight of the general's disapproval, but worse than that, he began to understand that his actions had consequences beyond the immediate confrontation. The security personnel flanking the general were taking notes, and cameras throughout the area had undoubtedly recorded every moment of his behavior. The realization that he might face actual consequences for his actions finally penetrated Marcus's arrogance, replacing his anger with something approaching panic. For the first time since the confrontation began, he found himself genuinely wanting to escape the situation he had created. The presence of General Sir Robert Thornfield had transformed the atmosphere around the palace gates from a public confrontation to something approaching an official inquiry. Marcus felt the weight of authority pressing down on him as the general's security detail continued their careful documentation of the scene, their cameras and notebooks capturing every detail of what would undoubtedly become an official record. "Sir," General Thornfield said, addressing Marcus with the kind of formal courtesy that somehow managed to be more cutting than outright hostility, "I understand you have concerns about the allocation of military resources and the value of ceremonial duties. These are legitimate policy questions that deserve serious consideration." Marcus felt a flicker of hope that perhaps the situation might be salvaged, that his concerns might be taken seriously by someone in authority. But the general's next words quickly dispelled that optimism. However, the general continued, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone delivering judgment. "The manner in which you've chosen to express these concerns raises serious questions about your character and your understanding of appropriate conduct in civil society." The crowd around them had grown silent, sensing that they were witnessing something significant unfold. Marcus found himself trapped between his desire to defend his actions and his growing awareness that any further argument would only make his situation worse. General Thornfield gestured toward Lance Corporal Mitchell, who continued to maintain his post with unwavering discipline despite the chaos swirling around him. "This soldier has demonstrated remarkable restraint and professionalism under circumstances that would test anyone's composure. His conduct reflects credit not only on himself, but on his regiment, his service, and his country." The general then, fixed Marcus with a stare that seemed to see right through his expensive suit and carefully cultivated image of success. Your conduct, in contrast, reflects poorly on whatever institutions or communities you represent. A man of your apparent education and social standing should understand that there are appropriate channels for policy concerns and appropriate ways to treat fellow human beings. Marcus felt his face burning with embarrassment and anger, but for the first time since the confrontation began, his anger was directed inward as much as outward. The systematic dismantling of his justifications had left him facing an uncomfortable truth about his own behavior and motivations. Furthermore, General Thornfield continued, your assumption that ceremonial duties represent wasted military resources demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of military organization and deployment. Lance Corporal Mitchell's medical limitations prevent him from returning to active combat duty, but his skills, experience, and character make him invaluable in his current role. The general paused, allowing his words to sink in before delivering what Marcus would later recognize as the decisive blow to his position. In fact, soldiers who serve in ceremonial roles often go on to training and leadership positions within the military. Their experience in maintaining discipline under pressure, dealing with the public, and representing military values makes them excellent candidates for instructor roles and non-commissioned officer positions. Marcus realized that even this aspect of his criticism was based on ignorance rather than understanding. The ceremonial duties he had dismissed as meaningless were actually part of a broader career development system that he had never bothered to investigate. But General Thornfield wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket and withdrew what appeared to be an official document. Mr. Wellington, he said, using Marcus's name for the first time, and causing a chill to run down the executive's spine as he realized his identity was known, Palace Security has been monitoring your behavior for the past 90 minutes. Your sustained harassment of one of my soldiers constitutes a breach of public order and potentially criminal behavior. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Throughout his campaign of humiliation, he had assumed that his social position and wealth would protect him from any serious consequences. The realization that he might actually face legal repercussions for his actions filled him with a panic he had rarely experienced in his privileged life. However, the general continued, Lance Corporal Mitchell has specifically requested that no formal charges be filed against you. Despite your treatment of him, he has expressed concern that criminal proceedings might cause you personal and professional harm that would be disproportionate to your offense. Marcus felt a wave of shock at this revelation. The soldier he had spent over an hour trying to humiliate was actually protecting him from the consequences of his own actions. The kindness and mercy shown by someone he had treated so cruelly forced Marcus to confront the reality of his own behavior in a way that all the arguments and evidence presented by the crowd had failed to achieve. For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus looked directly at Lance Corporal Mitchell, really seeing him as a person rather than a symbol of his grievances. The guard's posture remained perfect, his gaze still fixed straight ahead, but Marcus could now see the subtle signs of the strain he had caused. The slight tension around the eyes, the carefully controlled breathing, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. Marcus began, his voice faltering as he struggled to find words adequate to address what he had done. I didn't know. No. General Thornfield interrupted. You didn't know. But ignorance doesn't excuse cruelty, Mr. Wellington. A person of character seeks to understand before passing judgment, especially when that judgment involves attacking someone who cannot defend themselves. The general's words carried a weight of moral authority that Marcus found impossible to dismiss or argue against. For the first time in years, he found himself genuinely ashamed of his actions rather than simply frustrated by their consequences. Lance Corporal Mitchell, General Thornfield said, addressing the guard directly, "You are relieved for your scheduled break. Report to Sergeant Major Collins for debriefing." For the first time in over 2 hours, the guard moved. He executed a perfect about-face and began to march toward the palace with the same precise, disciplined movements that had characterized his entire time on duty. But as he passed Marcus, something extraordinary happened. Lance Corporal Mitchell stopped, turned slightly, and looked directly at Marcus for the first time. His eyes, when they met Marcus's, held no anger or resentment. Instead, they carried a sadness that seemed to encompass not just the treatment he had endured, but disappointment in the human capacity for cruelty toward fellow human beings. "Sir," Lance Corporal Mitchell said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the silence that had fallen over the crowd, "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." The simple statement, delivered without malice or sarcasm, hit Marcus harder than any insult or accusation could have. In that moment, he realized that his entire campaign of harassment had been motivated not by genuine concern for military resource allocation or institutional efficiency, but by his own anger and wounded pride over a perceived slight at a charity dinner. Lance Corporal Mitchell resumed his march toward the palace, leaving Marcus standing in the midst of a crowd whose opinion of him had shifted dramatically over the course of the morning. The executive felt exposed and diminished in a way that success and wealth had never prepared him to handle. General Thornfield approached Marcus once more, his expression stern but not entirely unsympathetic. "Mr. Wellington, you have been given an extraordinary gift today. One of the finest soldiers I have ever had the privilege to command has chosen to show you mercy rather than justice. I suggest you consider very carefully what you do with that gift." The general paused, then continued in a voice that carried unmistakable finality. "You will not be welcome on these grounds again, and your behavior today will be documented in our security files. Should you choose to repeat this kind of conduct at any royal residence or military installation, the consequences will be severe and immediate." Marcus nodded numbly, finally, understanding the full scope of what his morning's work had cost him. His access to one of London's most important cultural and political centers had been permanently revoked, and his behavior had been officially documented in ways that could impact his business and social relationships. As General Thornfield and his security detail departed, Marcus found himself alone with the crowd that had witnessed his systematic humiliation of a wounded veteran. The looks he received ranged from disgust to pity, but none carried the respect or admiration he had expected when he began his campaign. The elderly gentleman who had first challenged his behavior approached him one final time. "Young man," he said, his voice now carrying sadness rather than anger, "I hope you learned something today about the difference between courage and cruelty, between justice and revenge." Marcus wanted to respond, to defend himself, to explain his motivations and justify his actions. But for the first time in his adult life, he found himself truly speechless in the face of moral authority he couldn't dismiss or overcome. As the crowd began to disperse, many people stopping to express their admiration for Lance Corporal Mitchell's conduct and their disapproval of Marcus's behavior, the executive found himself alone with the consequences of his actions. The morning that had begun with his confident plan to expose what he saw as institutional hypocrisy had ended with the exposure of his own character flaws. Walking slowly away from the palace gates, Marcus felt the weight of genuine remorse for perhaps the first time in his adult life. The soldier he had tried to humiliate had shown him mercy, dignity, and grace under pressure that Marcus now understood he himself had never possessed. The realization that he had been shown such kindness by someone he had treated so cruelly forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own character and values. Over the following days, Marcus found himself unable to concentrate on his business dealings or social obligations. The image of Lance Corporal Mitchell's sad but forgiving eyes haunted him, along with the memory of the guard's final words, "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." Marcus began to realize that what he had been looking for all along was not justice or efficiency or reform of outdated institutions. What he had been seeking was validation for his own wounded pride and confirmation that his success and wealth made him superior to others. Among the veterans, Marcus recognized a familiar figure. Lance Corporal Mitchell, now in civilian clothes that revealed the extent of his injuries more clearly than his ceremonial uniform had allowed, was sitting with a young girl who was showing him a drawing she had made. The same one, not just for my behavior that day, but for my ignorance, my cruelty, and my assumption that I had the right to judge your service or your worth. Lance Corporal Mitchell studied Marcus for a moment, then gestured to an empty chair beside him. "Would you like to sit down, sir? Sarah here was just telling me about her drawing of a soldier helping people."